Hi everyone, and welcome back. In last week's tutorials, we learnt how to use audio samples to construct our own drum beats. This week, we'll instead be diving for the first time into the use of MIDI programming and software instruments to build our own drum beats. The Acid Xpress tutorials that this video will cover is this first tutorial video about editing MIDI clips in the timeline. But for anybody else who owns their own MIDI device, say like a MIDI keyboard or a launchpad, and you'd like to know how to use that in Acid Xpress, I'd also encourage you to watch these two in-house tutorials about recording and setting up your MIDI device. So we've got here an empty project to begin with. And unlike the rest of our work this semester, we'll be opening for the first time a MIDI or software track. We can do that by either right-clicking in this blank space here and selecting Insert MIDI Track, or by coming up to the Insert dropdown. So we'll go ahead and create a MIDI track. So there's just a few things that we're going to do in advance. First, we'll resize this MIDI track, and then we'll zoom our project in to see the first 2 bars in greater detail. Now, before we move on to programming drum beats, I'll just give a brief introduction to the concepts of MIDI programming and software instruments for those who are unfamiliar. So whereas we've been working with raw audio samples, so recorded acoustic energy, actually captured from an instrumentalist or taken from an existing audio file, we can instead think of MIDI as programmed performance data. This data in turn is fed into what we call a software instrument, which plays back that data so that we can hear it. So to demonstrate that, I'm going to come up to this button up here and toggle on inline MIDI editing. We can also press G on our keyboard. And we'll now see that a piano roll has appeared here to the left of our workspace. If we'd like to see more of this, we can again extend the view of our track. And we can also either scroll within this space or use these arrows at either end of the piano roll to navigate through the octaves of the piano. So going down for lower notes and up for higher notes. Now to actually use this, to actually program in some MIDI notes, we first drag out a MIDI clip region, which is simply specifying a region that we want to edit within. So to start, we'll drag out the first complete bar, and this defines our editable region. With this region and with the pencil tool selected, we can now start to draw in or program some MIDI data. And the basic things that this data is comprised of is a pitch, so how high or low a note is. If I just draw in a point here, we'll be able to move that data point up and down to change its pitch. We'll then also be able to edit its duration by dragging to the left and right, so a short note, as opposed to a held note. And then finally, we can double click a programmed data point to enter a velocity on a scale from 0 to 127. So if we were to put that to 120, the note would be much louder. And if we move it down to something, say 40, you'll have a much softer note, both in volume and in tone. Meaning that MIDI data, in summary, is a pitch, so how high or low, a duration, so how long to play for, and a velocity, so how loud and hard to play the note. For demonstration's sake, I'll now just program in a few different data points. And then we'll start to talk about software instruments. So this MIDI data, which we've just programmed by hand, is fed into a software instrument. And we can access those instruments over here. So by clicking here, this label, which is Piano 1 by default, we can access a reasonably extensive library of different instruments which will play back this same data. So for example, if I come down and select a type of synth, then we'll hear this performance data played back on a different instrument, like so. So again, I'll now change to a different instrument, say a guitar of some kind. And then perhaps to a wind instrument, maybe like a clarinet. So immediately we can already see that MIDI is quite flexible. We would never, using audio samples, be able to change the instrument playing back that sample. But to dig a little deeper just before we get into drum programming, it's also important to point out that MIDI is flexible because we can edit individual notes, another thing we would never be able to do with audio samples, unless we cut it up into very fine grains and do a lot of transposition and rearranging. So at the moment, these notes are quite delightful. But let's say I wanted that to sound a little darker, I could now edit these individual notes to change the overall effect. Of course, beyond that, we can also easily change the placement and duration of these notes. So if I'd wanted all of these notes to ring a little longer for a more dissonant effect, that can easily be achieved. Like so. So again, this is the level of detail and flexibility that MIDI programming provides. But what we'll do now is get into programming drums and percussion specifically. So to get started, we'll first delete this data, which can easily be done by using our selector tool just to highlight over all of it, and then simply delete. We'll then come back to selecting our software instrument and instead scroll down and choose a type of drum kit. So we'll just go with standard for now. And you'll see that quite conveniently, the piano roll has changed to a list of the different percussive layers or individual drums in this total drum kit that we've selected, which is a feature that GarageBand's MIDI editor doesn't actually have. So we can scroll up and down this list and look for the type of sound that we might want. And we can actually click each sound to audition them before we use any. So we might try out the cowbell, we might try a ride, a tom drum, or a crash cymbal. And another useful thing to note is that you can audition different velocities, so loudness of that note, by clicking further to the left or right of the item, like so. So again, a very useful interface. So now, just like last week, what we'll do to get started is refer to the basic framework of a kick drum or a bass drum, a snare drum, and a hi-hat. So we'll scroll down till we find it. It's usually in a lower octave in most software instrument drum kits, so further down a list. And we'll try out this bass drum, we'll try out a snare, and then we'll try a hi-hat. So if we're happy with those sounds, we can now start to program our own MIDI drum beat. We'll come up to our pencil tool here so that we can draw in some data. We'll plot in some data points in line with this closed hi-hat that we're intending to use, so like this. And again, if this is a rather tedious way to enter these points, Acid actually allows us to simply draw, and it will fill in the finest division available in the grid on your screen. So if we draw across this line here, Acid will fill in those hi-hats on each of these finest divisions. We'll apply the same to the first half of the bar, and then have a listen to see if we're happy with that pace. Great, so we can use that as a starting point. But as with last week, if we'd like to audition this drum beat more effectively, we'll zoom out a little, and then drag back this cycle looping region just to the duration of that bar so that we hear it repeatedly and we can try out different additions more rapidly. So now we'll zoom back in and start to add some other layers. As a starting point, we'll put a bass drum on the first and third beat in this first bar just to see how it sounds. And then once we're happy with that, we may elaborate the bass drum line. So we might try this. And we'll have a listen. And now, of course, we'll add a snare drum. So we could audition a few. And if it's this electric snare we like, then we know to draw in this row. So again, as per tradition, I'll start with a snare on the second beat and the fourth beat of a bar. Let's have a listen. So that's good, but again, if we would like to complicate it, maybe we could put another shorter snare before or after an existing event, so maybe here. And now let's have a listen. So this could now be our completed drum beat. We might be happy with how this sounds. But again, MIDI programming is much more flexible than the audio samples we were using last week. So say we wanted to try these programmed hi-hats here on a different sound, say maybe a ride cymbal or something else. We could simply select all of the data. So again, we'll use our selector tool to just highlight over it. We'll scroll up a little higher to find a sound that we like, say this ride cymbal. And then we'll drag each of these notes up to that line and have a listen. Of course, we could do the same with any of these other drums here, or we could even come back to our software instrument dropdown and select a different kit entirely. So a more electronic kit or a jazz kit or even a sound effects kit, but I'll leave that for you to explore. So I'll move these ride cymbals back down to the hi-hat for now. We'll scroll back down a little, and then we'll assume that this here is a finished drum beat that we're happy with and we're ready to start using it in our project at large. All we need to do is come back up here and toggle off the inline MIDI editing, like so. And then what we have is a usable clip, just like the audio samples and loops that we've been dragging in previously. So if I resize this track and then zoom out a little further, you'll see now that we just have a simple, easy to use clip, meaning that we can either copy it and paste it at new parts of our project, like so, or we can use our same pencil tool to draw in additional instances of the clip, like so. Of course, as with audio, we can also drag back these clips if we only want to use the first half of what we've created. But one thing to be very aware of anytime you're going to use a MIDI clip again and again in a project is that any edits made to the original will apply to all of the MIDI clip, wherever they are in your piece. So for example, if I come back to this first clip here, open back up my editor, and then just expand the track so I can see in more detail once more. If I were to actually draw in an additional note, say a snare drum here, it's appeared in all of the other clips that we're using. So that's just one thing to be very aware of. If we don't want that to happen, if we want a separate clip that we can edit independently, we simply have to define a new MIDI clip by dragging in an empty space, like so. We'll now have a separately numbered MIDI clip which we can edit freely without affecting the others. Great, so with the basics of editing covered, it's useful to note that there's a vast collection of different sounds here, even within the one drum kit, and then you have all of these other instruments to explore. So other types of world or non-drum kit percussion to experiment with, as well as some various sound effects. And again, it's important to note that MIDI programming can just trigger any sound. It can be told, for instance, that anytime you play the note C, trigger this bird sound or this dog sound, etc. It doesn't have to be a musical instrument and can just be mapped to anything. Another thing to note is that a MIDI track, just like an audio track, still has a volume slider and a panning slider. And then similarly, if I close down this editor for the moment and once more resize my track, we can also apply envelope editing, so drawing in a volume or panning envelope, just like we would on any of our audio tracks. So I can draw in data points and manipulate the volume or the panning. But I'll get rid of that for now. Turn off our envelope and then just get rid of some of these other clips that we've dragged in. We'll then just zoom back into some finer detail, and I'll also demonstrate for those interested how we might program in a pitched or melodic layer. We will be covering melody and using MIDI for melody in the later weeks of this semester as we lead up to Assessment 3, but again, anyone who's interested, I'd encourage you to go ahead and start to experiment now. So we'll create another MIDI track, expand the view as we did before, and then select a pitched instrument. So we might go with a guitar, say a funk guitar. Just as before, we'll turn on our MIDI editor to gain access to the piano roll, and we'll draw out an editable MIDI clip for this first bar. So just as with this drum list up here, we can also audition the actual pitches on the piano, meaning that we'll know what it is we're creating, but we can also actually hear the notes that we're drawing in real time, like so. So for demonstration's sake, I'll just draw in a small riff so that you can see the process. And now let's see how that works together. Great, so again, we could change that instrument to any other instrument available here. We could try a lead synth, for example, so this square wave sound, which is a very 80s type of sound. Or any other combination of instruments we so desire. And again, just once more, if we turn off this editor, we can manipulate these as actual clips. So we can copy this clip here and paste it later in our project. Or once more, we can actually draw the clip in. So hopefully that's given you a nice accessible introduction to the world of MIDI programming and software instruments. To summarize some pros and cons, MIDI has the advantage of being highly flexible and allowing us to edit individual notes and instruments in great detail. It brings with it the limitation that the sound quality generally isn't as good as recorded audio. Now, of course, software instruments, which we're feeding this MIDI data into for playback, have gotten a lot better over time, and you'll actually hear a lot of MIDI parts in the soundtracks for film and game alongside other recorded instruments. But most importantly for the scope of this course, MIDI programming and software instruments are a way for you to create and edit at a finer level of detail. So with all of that covered, your creative exercise for this week is to try and program your own drum beat using MIDI. So again, by using this editor and the pencil tool to draw in notes at the appropriate placement in a bar, and then trying different combinations of note placements, note types, so changing which drum or cymbal the note falls on, as well as experimenting with the kit that you're using. So seeing how it sounds, for example, on an electronic drum kit. Yes, I'd encourage you to go ahead and try to build your own MIDI drum beat, or perhaps even to try to reconstruct your drum beats from last week using MIDI instead. Again, anyone feeling brave enough can also go ahead and try to program some pitched MIDI data, so a short melody or a riff or something like that. Even material you already know as a test of how well you can edit in MIDI data. As always, you're welcome to direct any questions to the discussion forums or our online Collaborate sessions, and I hope you all enjoy. Thank you.